The announcement of the Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, brokered by the US, has sparked a lively debate on what these agreements are about and, of course, on what implications they could have. They have been depicted alternatively as merely transactional or, on the contrary, as transformational. So, what is the truth? The first thing we should agree upon is how to call these agreements. They have been labeled as peace agreements, but in fact they are normalization agreements, so agreements to establish diplomatic relations. They somehow took the world by surprise, but again, if we take a closer look, we see that there were a lot of informal contacts between Gulf states and Israel over the decade that intensified after 2015, when it appeared clear that the Obama administration was pursuing an engagement with Iran. So, this trend of growing ties between Israel and Gulf countries, we can say that it stems from a similar threat perception of these countries vis-à-vis Iran. Countries in particular were concerned that the sanctions relief that was granted to Tehran as part of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, would have translated into major financing for Iran's operations abroad and would have rehabilitated Tehran as a regional stakeholder, so no longer a pariah. However, over the last 2 years, and in particular over this last year, the perception of Iran in the region has somehow changed. Because as a consequence of sanctions and the COVID-19 pandemic, Iran is today significantly weaker. And for the UAE in particular, relations with Iran have become something that could be managed by means of diplomacy. And we have seen actually close encounters between Iranian and Emirati representatives over the last months. In the UAE's threat perception, the main threat today is no longer Iran, we could say, but it's the so-called Islamist axis composed by Turkey and Qatar. And in this sense, Israel could be an ally, especially if we take into consideration the fact that Gulf rivalries have already spilled over into the Mediterranean, so closer to Israel too, as in the Eastern Mediterranean crisis or the proxy war in Libya. So, we can qualify these agreements as normalization agreements, as not so unexpected agreements, but are they game-changing? Well, for sure, these agreements are not just symbolic. They are not just a pre-election gift for Trump. The US in the last 4 years have invested strategically in the Gulf states as key partners, primarily the Saudis and the Emiratis. And of course, this trend is here to stay, so regardless of who wins in the next US presidential elections, this trend of normalization between Israel and Arab states will continue. So even if Biden wins, this trend will continue probably, as right now there is a lot of consensus and even enthusiasm in Washington for this. However, it is important to recall that there is a lot of potential in these agreements, but there are also potential pitfalls because they could increase regional tensions, because they, of course, risk of brushing aside the Palestinian issue, and last but not least, they promise to bring about a new trend of increased defense spending both in Israel and in the Gulf states. That promises to enrich the US arms industry, of course, but maybe that is not what the region needs the most right now. So for the moment, these agreements, we can say that they remain transactional. It's a transaction because it derives from a narrow coincidence of interests between the US, Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and we can count Sudan into. Whether or not they will become transformative, it will depend on what will follow in the next months and I would say years. So who else signs up? In particular, if Saudi Arabia signs up, it will be a potential game changer. But also, of course, what will happen to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because actual peace and stability in the region can only be achieved when all countries are part of a project. So, For these normalization agreements to become peace agreements, a true regional process should start, taking into consideration the interests of all the actors in the region. Otherwise, the risk of increasing rivalries and spark further confrontation.